What are your helpful suggestions?
That's how we feel now, the discussion
Oh. It's a bit like that Thomas Allen story you told me tonight, Lizzie. Do we all know who Thomas Allen is? Anyone not quite sure? Just raise your hands if you're not quite sure. Well, he's one of the gifted, he's a world-class, very gifted baritone. Very versatile. And he comes from a humble background. In which city, Liz?
Well, I don't know, it's in County Durham or somewhere, I don't know where.
County Durham somewhere. Might be Durham, might it?
No.
But it's a mining area. It's a mining village, right. And he went back to his roots to do a concert. Is that right, Liz? It was in a church. And he's a very fine artist. And he and his accompanist went to the church to ascertain all the arrangements were adequate, as they should be, for the evening. The church warden was there, and so as they left, Thomas Allen said to the church warden, "See you this evening." And the church warden said, "No, I won't be there." So Allen said, "Oh, why is that?" He said, "Oh, I've heard you once." Bring on the videos. So, any suggestions, friends, apart from videos?
If the Jesus breath of the Greek Christians and the Sufis had a common inheritance, where do you trace it back to?
I would strongly suspect to the Ajapa Mantra, wouldn't you? It's only a suspicion, but it would seem to fit. See, what is not widely realized, certainly wasn't taught to me at school, and very few people appreciate the fact today, is the influence of the Aryan inheritance throughout the ancient world. Now, the Vedas, as you know, the world's most ancient, substantial body of spiritual literature, is in its early form of unspecifiable antiquity. Thousands of years BC, long before writing was invented, the hymns of the Rig Vedas were passed on by folk tradition, by living inheritance. the verbal transmission. It's an error to believe that some scholars seem to too readily assume that a teaching began at the time when it was first written about. It may well be that the essence of a teaching goes back to a period much beyond the beginning of writing. For example, Akhenaten. It's said that it's claimed by some, he was the first monist, the first one to teach the one God. Now, a similar claim can be made for the Rig Veda. Freud came along with some very interesting observations in his book on Moses. He mentioned the turmoil of the time in the period of Akhenaten and the supposed period that immediately followed it, that of Moses. Enormous political upheaval in ancient Egypt, with intense rivalries between the main priesthoods, all vying for political power. And in Freud's view, what left Egypt as part of the Exodus was not only Hebrews, but also many others who did not fit the political demands of the ruling faction. And amongst those would have been the Mitannis. This is Freud's view, and the descendants of the Mitannis. And adherents of the Heliopolitan priesthood. Freud maintains that the priesthood of Heliopolis, the most ancient of the Egyptian priesthoods, was responsible for the monistic teaching, and that Akhenaten gave voice to it, established it in the state structure, but was not the inventor of it. He was the inheritor. That seems to me a very reasonable view. Now, I mention the Rig Veda because Akhenaten's grandfather, had a great appetite for Mitanni princesses. And Mitanni princesses were imported over a considerable period of time into the Egyptian household, together with their entourage, which would have included priests, warriors, scribes, servants, etc. So I don't actually remember exactly what the lineage is, but Akhenaten had several Mitanni stepmothers and aunts and things of that kind. Now, who were the Mitanni? It's an interesting word. Fairly literally, it would seem to mean the friendly ones. The word derives from Mitra, one of the Hindu sun gods. The two principal sun gods would normally be supposed to be Mitra and Varuna. Mitra, the lord of light, Varuna, the lord of the waters, both of them sun gods. There you have that they were so closely linked that they were sometimes stated as one, Mitra hyphen Varuna. Interestingly, in this respect, the high priest of the ancient Soma ceremonial was called the Mitra Varuna, fusing of fire and water, a very alchemical image, as part of a process in developmental psychology of grasping the union of heaven and earth. Now, these Mitanni people, not a lot is known about them. Round about 1600 BC, a time of turmoil. Actually, before we say that, perhaps we should mention the thinking of some scholars on the matter. (1750 BC, about. A people called the Hyksos came pouring out of Asia, meaning Anatolia, the Caucasus area of Anatolia. Hyksos is a Semitic word that means shepherd kings. They invaded Egypt, overwhelming Egypt by their superior skills in war, particularly something to which the Egyptians then had no answer, that is, horsemanship and the chariots. Now, a characteristic of the Mitanni warriors was they were thought to be the best horsemen in the world and were amazingly adroit at chariot warfare. So the Hyksos dynasty was established in Egypt, thought to be a Semitic dynasty, but some scholars would say the characteristic of this expertise in horsemanship and chariotry suggests that there was a Mitanni ruling caste of these Hyksos. Now, this would be typical of the way these Mitanni people operated. They invaded a territory, subdued it by their military skills, became the ruling caste, and they dominated the whole area. Therefore, it may well be that the Hyksos dynasty was in fact a Mitanni dynasty in Egypt. That is an Aryan dynasty. Aryan meant literally noble. A number of variations of that word, Aryan. There was a substantial Caucasian tribe called the Alans, A-L-A-N, and that's one variant of it. Another variant is the ancient name of Ireland, Erin, which is a variant of Aryan. Now, around about 1750 then, it could be, the Mitanni, who appeared to originate from Iran, came pouring into the Levant and into Egypt and dominated, became the Pharaonic line. Now, round about 1700 BC, they came pouring out of Iran again. A people called the Kassites, who were neither Semitic nor Indo-European, but again had this Aryan ruling caste. They overthrew all the princes of Chaldea and established a Mitanni dominion of the whole of Chaldea, the whole of Mesopotamia region. So that's the Hyksos in about 1750, the Kassites in about 1700. Iran seems to have been the area from which they emerged. Now, there was a Babylonian historian named Berosos. How would you pronounce it properly, Sherry?
Berosos.
I said it right, did I?
Yes.
I thought it must be accent on the last syllable. Berosos, who's normally thought to be reliable, and he stated that 2000 BC, Babylonia was ruled by Mitanni people, Aryans. Now, I strongly suspect there were enormous population shifts in the ancient world. At the time of Krishna, which may have been about 2000 BC, and Abraham is put at about the same time. Enormous shifts of population. It's thought by some that Abraham, living in Sumeria, was part of a displacement that occurred because a savage horde came again pouring out of Iran called the Guti. What does Guti mean? And did much destruction of civilization. So that may well be a factor that caused the clan of Abraham to move. Now, I have a strong suspicion. You see, after the Great War of Kurukshetra, it appears, I think by implication, the Pandavas unquestionably took their instructions from Krishna. And after the Great War, presumably consistent with the will of Krishna, the Pandavas, Yudhishthira, the senior prince of the Pandavas, led the Kuru people out of India in a return to the homeland. The homeland said to be in the northwest, and the route that would have been taken along the ancient trade routes would have led to the region of Mount Ararat. And as some scholars have pointed out, Mount Ararat is in fact an Aryan name. Now, we won't take that very much further, but I strongly suspect that these massive movements of populations, warriors, the Aryan warriors overrunning various tribes, various territories, establishing dominion, was part of this movement of the Kurus back into the Caucasus region, Anatolia and so on, and down into the Levant. Now, at the time of Akhenaten, the records that archaeology uncovered at a place called Tel Amarna were of very great interest. And one of the things they showed was that 1/3 of the ruling princes of the land of Canaan had Aryan names, that is, Mitanni names. 1/3. And there were others who might well be of Mitanni stock, but had not necessarily taken but might well have taken a more local name. Now, it's of some interest that when Abraham moved into Canaan, he moved into the territory of the king of the Hittites. And the Hittites were an Indo-European people. And the Hittite kingdom proper was to the north of Syria. And the Hittites, around 1800 BC, had a very powerful civilization. It's also a fact, as archaeology uncovered, that the people called Horites and Hivites in the Bible were Armenian stock, Armenoids. Now, the people called Mitanni, who emerged from Iran possibly in force around 1600 BC, by the year 1500 BC, had established a very strong state called Mitanni in northern Mesopotamia and southern Anatolia. And the people themselves, the mass of the people themselves were Armenoids, which meant they had brachycephalous heads, amongst other things. But the ruling caste was Mitanni, the Aryan warrior caste. Now what I'm leading up to in all this is the extraordinary fact, which hit me as an extraordinary fact, because I'd never learned any such thing, was that from the borders of China in the east and from the Indian Ocean in the east across to the Mediterranean, there was an unbroken chain of city-states ruled over by Aryan princes, Mitanni princes. So the influence throughout the Middle East was not merely Semitic. Indeed, it came as a shock to the late 19th century to discover that a people called the Hittites were Indo-Aryan. Now, the ruling caste of the Hittites, the ruling caste of the Mitanni, the ruling caste of Chaldea, possibly the ruling caste of Egypt, and many of the princes of the Levant were Mitanni, with Mitanni traditions, Mitanni teachings. And as the records have shown, they worshipped Vedic gods, they worshipped Mitra, they worshipped Varuna, they worshipped the Nasatas, they worshipped Indra. Now, what I'm saying also is that that's the external form, that's their mythology. But also with it would go the ritual processes that they were heir to, and many perhaps deeper teachings, including the one God teaching, monism. So, when we're looking for a common root, I think it can go back a long way. And I strongly suspect that the common root eventually could be traced back to that Ajapa mantra. What do you think? Anything else, friends? Yes, Pete? Come on, don't be shy.
So are you suggesting that Jesus' line comes from this root as well?
Well, you see, what is quite clear is that archaeology has revealed that the population of the Levant was not exclusively Semitic, not by any means. And that you can clearly discern the Semites and the Mitanni element and the Armenians. I mean, Armenian pottery was found in the region of Judea, and also in the region of what is supposed to be Sodom and Gomorrah. And you know where the word Palestine comes from? It's the Anglicization of the Roman name for the region, which was Philistia. So called because people descended from the Philistines, were so numerous, and the Philistines were Indo-Aryan. Now it says in the Bible that the population of Jerusalem at the time of Melchizedek, that is the time of Abraham, was Hittite and Aramaic. Was Aramaic and Hittite. Now, the Aramaic people had an Aryan ruling caste, and the Hittites were Aryans. And Melchizedek, who was king of Jerusalem, king of Salem, was a figure who was acknowledged, it appears, by Abraham to be his superior, and with whom Abraham commemorated in ritual form something approximating the Eucharist using bread and wine. It says so in Genesis. Now, the house of David, it is thought, derives from the ruling clan of that region. So it would be consistent for this to be so because of the warrior tradition of the Aryans. See what I mean? And so the line of David, which was a carefully preserved cooler. Do we all know what cooler is? It was the practice of the ancient world to give great credibility to what it was in a very refined form of eugenics, selective breeding, so that it was important that the strong combined with the strong to perpetuate the strong. And that the children of rishis and the children of the rulers, the children of the rajas, were unblemished in that sense. And that the spiritual transmission that passed through the rishis from parent to child, part of that transmission was their physical structure, which they inherited, and had to be of a kind that could carry the power of knowledge. Knowledge is power. Shakti is power. It needs a certain sort of nervous system to channel the Kundalini. Now, the Kula, the line of inheritance, carefully guarded inheritance, would have been particularly strong with the house of David. In fact, at the time of Jesus, to even say that you were a member of the house of David would get you eliminated by the Romans, because it was dangerous stuff, this house of David, politically. So it's a reasonable line of supposition. Of course, another thing is this. It's a very strange business, you know. The Levant, the area of Lebanon, which was the region of the Phoenicians, who spoke a Semitic language, was very much overrun by the Greeks. At the time of Mycenae, the Trojan Wars and all that stuff, there was a huge influx of Greeks into the Lebanon. And it's a most curious thing. There's a Penguin book on the Phoenicians, quite a good book. And the cover shows a photograph of a line of sarcophagi with the features of those inside carved on it. And every one of those sarcophagi, a whole line of them, had the typical ancient Greek profile, you know, straight line down the forehead, down the nose. That's extraordinary, and no one comments on that. Anyway, that is a fact, that there was this big influx of Mycenaean Greeks into the Lebanon. Later, when the Greek Empire was established, there was another huge influx of Greeks. And the primary cities of the Lebanon were Tyre, Sidon, and Byblos. And collectively they were known as Sidonians. And in the time of Jesus, to be called a Sidonian almost certainly meant you were a Greek speaker, and very possibly meant you were of Greek descent. Now I mention this because the 2nd century rabbis stated as a dogma that Jesus was a bastard, as we all know, and that his father was a Roman soldier, was a soldier in the Roman army, who was an archer who came from Tyre. And this could mean his father was a Greek. Hitler believed that. I don't say there's any credibility to be ascribed to it, I just say that Hitler had a prejudice that built on the ideas of certain German scholars who were responsible for the discovery of the Hittites and all that. Another interesting thing is that one of King David's commanders was Uriah the Hittite, obviously a Hittite. There was a liaison between King David and the Hittite's wife, Bathsheba. Not unreasonable to assume that she also was a Hittite. And the child of that liaison was Solomon.
When you say the Kula is protected, in that example, the first result of that liaison was the child had died. Isn't it Bathsheba's?
Yeah,
And David seduced her while Uriah was out fighting.
yeah, yeah.
So
This is not a pretty story.
It's not a pretty story.
No.
It's difficult.
No.
So who's protecting the Kula? I mean, it's obviously not David because it was just a passionate affair. Isn't it? I mean, that's
Well,
what
look,
struck him.
Look, when David was bravely denounced by Zadok the priest, in a line that would seem to derive from Melchizedek. Yeah. Meaning, Zadok meant righteousness. It is very interesting. Clearly, something happened there that should not have happened. But if you look at the story, David, when walking on his palace roof terrace, could look down and see Bathsheba bathing. Now, reverse that. Imagine what sort of a man David was. Maybe not so very far removed from the David of Michelangelo's imagination. And it seems to me fairly obvious that Bathsheba must have been well aware that the king whom she so greatly admired was walking up there, and she didn't pull the curtain, did she? So, there's a pull there of nature. There's a pull of nature. And the result was Solomon. And who can regret Solomon? There's a tradition about Solomon, of course, that is much more colourful than the details provided in the Old Testament. A great adept, renowned for wisdom, could subdue the spirits of all the worlds. And that's another story, isn't it? So, where do we go from there? Any other points we want to raise?
You mentioned Joseph the other night, and the Bible refers to
Yes.
Joseph as being with God, and so he was able to be a success in whatever
Yes.
situation he
Yeah.
found himself
Yeah.
in.
Yeah.
So, presumably the Indo-Aryans with a wisdom tradition, it's that's carrying them across the world, not their... I mean, I know they have their chariots and their horses, but that must be secondary.
Well, I'm not going to pick up on that one, but I will add this, that it's always interested me that Joseph formed a natural bond with the Heliopolitan tradition. That's a Greek word, Heliopolis, city of the sun. The Egyptian word was even more interesting. The Egyptian word was On, translated by the Greeks as city of the sun. And On, of course, is virtually identical with Om, is it not? And the Om is the Logos, the word of the primal light. Now, this word Joseph, this name Joseph, Yusuf in Arabic, I believe, Yusuf. It derives, according to Schönberg, it derives from a mystic, a Hebrew mystic, called Yuz Asaph. Yuz Asaph. Now, according to Schönberg, philologically, Yud, as in Yuda, Yud and is the same as Yuz in Yusuf and Yuz Asaph, and the same as Bud in Buddha. And they're variants of the same root which signifies the sun. So Asaph was water, and Yuz Asaph indicated the fusion of sun and water, sun and earth, fire and water. You see? So that's the meaning of Joseph. Schönberg draws other philological connections with Egypt and so on that we won't go into now, because I can't remember them. But Joseph is in fact a Christ story. There are meanings much beyond the simple tale that appears in the Old Testament. Joseph was a man of rare gifts, a child of rare gifts. There was a subtle transmission linked with this tribe. And the initiation of Joseph was expressed by the award to him of his father of a coat of many colours. No one asks really what this coat of many colours is or was, but I would offer the thought that it was a priestly garment, indicating the fact that the wearer of the garment was fully active in all the chakras. All the centers and all their colours were alive. This was acknowledged by the father, Jacob. And it caused dissension with the other brothers, obviously. And he had gifts appropriate to such an individual. He could foretell the future. He could certainly translate dreams. And it may reasonably be assumed, seems to me, he had this faculty of direct seeing. Now, what happened to him? Rejected, scorned. First of all, thrown into a well. Isn't that interesting? Well, what does a well symbolize? Then sold into slavery. Then there are various adventures. He resurrects as the right hand of the Pharaoh, who places him in that position because the Pharaoh recognizes his amazing gifts. And the Pharaoh gives him another name, which in Egyptian I cannot remember what it reads like. The Pharaoh gives him another name. And the name translates as the Saviour. The Saviour. So Joseph becomes the Saviour. Now, do you know what Jesus means? Do you know what Jesus means?
Saviour.
Yeah. The actual name, our anglicised word, Jesus, is from the Greek Iesus, which is the Greek form of the Hebrew Yoshua. So the name of Jesus was actually Joshua, which means the Saviour. So that, as there was this, as it were, translation or transmission from Joseph to Jesus in the avatar, so similarly there was this translation from Joseph to Jesus. At the time when he wedded the wife of the high priest of Heliopolis. Interesting, isn't it? Anything else, comrades? We'll say it's time for tea then. Having said we were going to see a video, then obviously we're now going to see a video.
Have you read that the Philistines were in fact the Trojans, fleeing from the fall of Troy?
I've heard that said. They just don't know where they came from, do they?
It's an interesting idea, though.
Yeah, they were called the Sea Peoples. It is assumed the Philistines were the Sea Peoples, and no one knows where the Sea Peoples came from except from the sea. But they must have been immensely powerful to overthrow the Hittites, which were the most powerful nation in the ancient world. The Hittites went to war with the kingdom of Mitanni, and they overthrew the Mitanni. So it would suggest a bit more than just the remnants of...
True, but all these people seem to pick up other peoples as they travel.
That's right. One of the things that is most intriguing when you look at the archaeological evidences in the ancient world is the incredible mobility of ancient nations. Quite amazing. And we were talking about Mitra, the Vedic sun god. In the form of Mithras, he was worshipped throughout the length and the breadth of the Roman Empire. From York, in the north of England, from Germany, right across Europe, right across all the Roman domains, and Iran and India, you had the worship of Mitra. In many senses, the forebear of Christ, in many ways.
Just one final small point. The Alexander the Great program. In what way would you correct the impression or change the impression that program gave us about his character? And what was left out in your view?
Well, he was a very complex personality, wasn't he? He was incredibly ruthless on the one hand. He was extraordinarily humanitarian on the other. And was very highly cultured and something of a philosopher in his own right. How would one change it?
No, I didn't mean that. I just meant did the program give a false impression? That was
Well, it didn't, I don't think, bring out the fact that the Greeks, wherever they went, made an enormous cultural impact, which affected and altered the cultural development of the territories that they invaded. And artistically, this is certainly true. But when you think that Alexandria in Egypt was such an important city that as a centre for the teaching of philosophy, shortly after Alexander, it became even more important than Athens. And there were so many strands operating, such cultural fusion. There was the indigenous Egyptian. There was the huge impact of the Greeks. There was the fact that the Essenes were settled near Alexandria, on the shores of Lake Mazaretis, is it? Is that what you call it? Yeah. And that seemingly Philo, the Jewish philosopher, was in touch with these strands. And that the trade routes of the ancient world brought every conceivable influence into that region, which included Buddhist missionaries being very influential from India. And of course, they founded the world's greatest library, which accumulated all the knowledge and all the wisdom of the ancient world, which was destroyed by the invading Mohammedans in the 7th century. Who knows what wisdom might be revealed to the modern world if those records still existed. No, I would have liked to have seen much more of it was Alexander the warrior, but we needed also to see the enormous cultural impact, impetus that was given to the territories that he invaded.
Alexander the alcoholic.
And
Alexander
and
was a homosexual. Alexander.
That's right.
Blah, blah, blah.
Yeah. It was a
And
sort
you've
of
got the impression of a kind of dynamic, almost mindless force
yeah,
that was inhabiting this guy
yes,
and propelling him across these
yes,
continents.
yes,
Like conquest was a sort of drug for him.
yes, and yet. It brought about an enormous cultural impetus. And we talk about the Judeo-Christian world, don't we? The Judeo-Christian tradition. But it's at least as much the Greek Christian tradition. Because all of Christian philosophy was based on what they derived methodologically from the ancient Greeks. And the Greeks, inheriting seemingly in a transmission from Iran, the Vedic idea of the cosmic man, anthropos, which St. Paul called Christos, anthropos, which is fairly clearly a translation of the Hindu idea of the cosmic man, the Purush. You see, what's not too clearly realized is that the center point of Vedic culture was in fact Iran. And it overspilled into northwest India on the one hand, and into Anatolia and northern Mesopotamia on the other, as a massive sphere of influence. Then it finally became consolidated most strongly in northwest India. But originally it was from Iran. Is that right? Yeah, she says so.
Why is it still such a hotbed of really sort of intensity of feeling? I mean, why is it still there?
Well, ask her. She's fled from it.
Yeah.
Do you see a sort of overall guiding intelligence in all this? Helen?
Of course.
And that intelligence would use the passions of mankind to direct it in the way it was.
It uses what is there. Uses what is there, whatever it is.
Whatever it is. So you have a guiding intelligence that's leading man in a way. And on the one hand, and then on the other hand, you get someone like Jung who says we may not get round the corner.
Well, I'm glad Jung said that. Jung's warnings should be heeded, because this is the first time the human race has actually possessed the power to totally destroy the planet. Totally and suddenly. And it might happen. It's very, very dangerous. And when you look at this prodigious potentiality for destruction, and you look at the rulers of nations and those who control it, you think, my God, it's in the hands of Clinton. I mean, what are you to say? What are you to say? Democracy labours. You know, my view of democracy is that of the bloke who said it's bloody awful, but it's better than any other alternative you can think of. When you think it labours and it throws up Clinton, etc. If ever there was a time when power should be in the hands of wisdom, it's now.
So where is this guiding intelligence now?
Right. So what is this guiding intelligence doing? It's saying to the human race, the master level will not overtly be in control. You must now increasingly be seen to be responsible for the outcome of your actions. We, ourselves. We've got a little beyond the toddler stage. We've got to stand up and start assuming some responsibility. We're at the level of unstable adolescence, aren't we? We, collectively, the human race. I mean, it's a great parable in old Clinton, isn't it? Dear, oh dear, oh
Well, is
dear.
it any worse than what David did? I mean, you know, it's always happened throughout history, hasn't it? At one minute we say that's all right because
yes,
it's the use
yes.
of Solomon. There's a
No,
guy
no,
who-
no.
Clinton, we say,
No,
Excuse
that-
me,
that-
did he actually have sex? That's what he said.
Look,
Oh, that's all
look, David was not an ordinary bloke.
no, I understand that, Alan, but he,
I mean, Mr. Clinton is.
yes.
I mean, there was a previous candidate for the American presidency, wasn't it? And I'm sure he was accurate when he said of Clinton, he's middle management material. Yeah. I mean, you wouldn't even give him a big job if you were running an efficient show. It's an extra. Oh dear, we got an American with us. Am I being presumptuous in my judgments, madam? Oh dear, I've forgotten. But you know what I mean, don't you? Now David was a very special bloke.
Yeah, I not, but he did have his other side, and what he did to
Yes,
Uriah was
yes, yes,
outrageous.
yes,
I think it is.
yes, yes.
Listen, we're talking about free will now, so we've got the power to,
Right.
we've now got the freedom
Right.
to make or break.
Right.
But the power is in the hands of a very few ruthless people, isn't it? When you
Only because we allow it to be so. Why are we such a Talmudic mass that permits it?